Hello, my name is Gary. I belong to the Orlando Monthly Meeting in Florida. I've been a Quaker for a few years, and I've really enjoyed learning about the life of George Fox. One day when I was looking through his journal, I noticed that back in the year 1671, he left England for a voyage to America. I was really interested in that journey, so a few months ago I decided to learn some details about the 2 years he spent on that trip. Then I put together this video to highlight parts of his journey that particularly interested me. I hope you'll find these things interesting too. By way of background, it was in the year 1652 when George climbed Pendle Hill in northwest England. He scanned the view from up there and felt a leading to take his faith to the masses of truth-seeking people down below. He wrote, "I saw the Lancashire Sea, and there atop of the hill I was moved to sound the day of the Lord. And the Lord let me see atop of the hill in what places he had a great people to be gathered." What George called the Lancashire Sea would technically be the Irish Sea, a part of the Atlantic Ocean. It probably never crossed George's mind, though, that his ministry might take him all the way to America one day. But 20 years later, there he was, preaching to crowds in the American colony of Maryland. The sketch you see here gives an idea of what his gatherings look like. I think the drawing is well done, but I believe the artist made George look too young. George was actually in his late 40s at the time. But the rest of the scene, from what I've read, is quite accurate. Civic officials, religious leaders, and even Indians came to hear George. His name and fame had been spread far and wide by the many Quaker settlers in America. Here's another sketch of George preaching in Maryland. Now this colorful scene shows people gathered in the New York City area to hear George. The town was Flushing on Long Island. It's now part of the borough of Queens. George was invited by a prominent Quaker there to hold a gathering under 2 large trees on his farm. Afterward, those 2 trees became known as the Fox Oaks. On the right of the picture, that must be George's getaway horse. I'm just kidding. Around 1900, the Flushing Historical Society commemorated the very spot where George preached under the oak trees. They placed a granite marker that is still there. The inscription reads, "Here stood the Fox Oaks, beneath whose branches George Fox, founder of the Society of Friends, preached June 7th, 1672. Here's a local television piece featuring that Fox Oaks marker.
This rock marks the spot where Quaker founder George Fox preached. There were originally 2 oak trees here when the land was a part of John Bound's garden.
I was curious about the routes taken by the ships that George sailed on. He boarded his first ship near London and sailed for 7 long weeks on a trade route that went down the coast of Africa and across the Atlantic to Barbados, which was a major British colony in the Caribbean at the time. George tells in his journal that his ship's name was Industry. After a few months in Barbados, George took a short 10-day sail over to the island of Jamaica. George ministered a few months in Jamaica and then left on a ship bound for Maryland in America. check out the U-turn the ship made near the tip of Cuba. The captain had to make this turn because after several days at sea fighting off stiff headwinds, the ship had made so little forward progress that Jamaica was still in view. So the captain changed course and sailed around the western end of Cuba. After that, the ship went past the Florida Keys and up the east coast of America. To get to its destination in central Maryland, George's ship steered into the Chesapeake Bay and sailed north past the Potomac River. Then the ship entered the Patuxent River, where it finally anchored. So after 5 long, difficult weeks on the water, George was finally able to set foot on American soil. Using Maryland as his headquarters, George spent the next year traveling by boat and horseback, preaching and visiting Quaker meetings. He went south a ways through Virginia and the Carolinas and north as far as Rhode Island. Pennsylvania wasn't on George's itinerary because it hadn't been founded yet. It would be another 10 years before William Penn would establish Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia. Let me back up for just a minute to show the kind of ships George sailed on. From what I've read, they were much like this one, with 2 masts and square sails. The ships were probably similar to the Mayflower, the ship that brought the Pilgrims to Massachusetts 50 years beforehand. The ship pictured here is a replica of the Mayflower. Ocean-going ships in the 17th century were terribly cramped and unsafe, but most of them ultimately reached their destinations. I was surprised to learn how quickly English Quakers migrated to the Caribbean and America during the first few years of George's ministry that he began in 1652. Before Fox's visit, Quakers had been established in Barbados in 1655, in Maryland and New England by 1656, and groups were in New York and New Jersey when Fox arrived in 1672. There was a total of about 50 passengers and crew on Industry, George's ship. You see here the names of 12 Quakers who traveled with George. You might call them Fox and friends. I've learned a bit about 3 of these friends: William Edmondson, Solomon Eccles, and Elizabeth Houghton. William Edmondson was known as the Irish Hammer. He had been a powerful Quaker preacher in Ireland. The journal he kept during the voyage to America adds many interesting details to George's account. In America, Edmondson ministered in what was then simply called Carolina. The marker you see is in the town of Hertford, North Carolina. It credits Edmondson for leading the first religious service in the colony and goes on to recognize George Fox's work there. Here's a picture of Solomon Eccles. This strange man had been a noted English musician, but when he became a Quaker, he abandoned his career entirely and became a sort of a religious fanatic. He was famous around London for preaching repentance while nearly naked and balancing a pan of burning coals on his head. These pictures of Elizabeth Houghton are from a recent play about her life. She was the only Quaker traveling with George who had been to America previously. She had a fervent desire to return and do more missionary work in the colonies. Two special people came to say bon voyage to George as he prepared to sail. There was his wife of 2 years, Margaret, who had been released from prison just in time to see him off. And George's good friend William Penn was there as well. I was amazed to read that George and his wife, the former Margaret Fell, were together for only about 4 of their 22 years of marriage. It seems prison terms and mission travels kept them apart for long periods of time. Let me describe a few joys and concerns I read about that were experienced by George and his followers on the first leg of their voyage. Joys were few, but the Quakers relished having meeting for worship twice a week. These meetings were a wonderful source of support for the Quakers during the difficult journey, and one other joy was the fresh fish that were occasionally caught by the ship's crew. The fish supplemented the mediocre food carried on the ship. One remarkable day, a flying fish landed right on the ship's deck. I imagine it ended up on the dinner table. Concerns on this ship included a bad leak in the hull. From the minute they boarded, the passengers and crew had to share in bailing water that was pouring through a fist-sized hole. By one estimate, 10 tons of seawater were flowing into the ship each day. Fortunately, the leak was eventually plugged. As if the leak weren't bad enough, there was conscription. There were British officials who could legally board ships and remove crewmen and force them to serve in the Royal Navy. And some of them boarded George's ship, and they began to remove 4 of the crew. George appealed to the officials, explaining how desperately those men were needed to help bail the water gushing into the ship. And the officials were sympathetic, and they returned 2 of the men. Then there were pirates. This problem arose about the 3rd week at sea. Off the coast of Africa, a ship appeared to be chasing them. The captain believed it was a Moroccan pirate vessel. The ship was drawing closer and closer as the day wore on. George conferred with his frightened captain, who decided the best thing was to change course during the night and loop around behind the pirates. Next morning, there was great relief when the pirate ship was nowhere to be seen. There was also much illness on the ship. George suffered terribly. His legs became swollen, burning, and itchy. He couldn't hold down food. One writer has compared his symptoms to rheumatic fever. George sustained himself, sipping beer, wine, and tasting some powdered ginger. One day, he and the other sick Quakers were treated to a wonderful broth made from a freshly caught dolphin. The tasty broth was very comforting and helped everyone feel a little bit better. George was so ill when he reached Barbados that it took him a month to regain his strength. There were about 1,000 Quakers living on Barbados, and George was surprised at how wealthy they were. The majority of them were affluent plantation owners, not farmers and tradesmen like Quakers in England. George had to bear the brunt of the complaints hurled by the Barbados government against the Quakers living on the island. Like all good Quakers, they refused to serve in the island militia. They refused to pay taxes to the island government, and they refused to pay tithes to the Barbados branch of the Church of England. The Quakers on Barbados had slaves working on their farms and sugar plantations, and George was very much against slavery, but he must have felt it was not the right time to condemn the Quakers for their practice. Instead, he urged them to treat their slaves well and include them in Quaker spiritual life. George discovered that Quakers on the island were randomly burying their deceased slaves and family members here and there, anywhere, in their lawns and gardens. He instructed them to create special Quaker cemeteries and keep records of all the burials there. George also dealt with unseemly marriage situations on the island. He found instances of Quakers having more than one spouse, marrying close relatives, remarrying much too quickly after losing a spouse, and even offering young teen daughters for marriage. Now, John Drakes and Abia Trott were a couple George had known in England. John was from Barbados originally, and on a visit to England is when he met Abia, a young Quaker orphan whose parents had left her a large fortune. It so happened that George was serving as one of Abia's gardens at the time, and one day John Drakes asked him for permission to court the young woman. George refused because he knew of John Drake's reputation as a foul-mouthed, money-grubbing drunkard. But George's refusal made John Drake so angry that when he returned to Barbados, he told people that if George Fox ever came to their island, he, John Drakes, would have George burned alive. As it turned out, though, shortly before George did arrive in Barbados, John Drakes died from a terrible fever. People said his body was blackened and charred as if he had been burned alive. That is some irony. Some significant things happened during the months George spent in Jamaica. He soon learned of a shipping company traveling between Jamaica and America that charged 10 shillings less per passenger than the competitor. He wasted no time in buying tickets for the Quakers' next passage. A sad event during the time in Jamaica was the death of friend Elizabeth Hooton. She was quite elderly and passed peacefully before she could follow her dream of doing more missionary work in America. Remember Solomon Eccles, the Quaker fanatic with fire on his head? He decided to stay in Jamaica, and as far as I know, George didn't argue with him. Sometime later, Solomon Eccles sailed up to Boston, and he caused so much trouble up in the Massachusetts colony that he was banned from it. He eventually returned to the Caribbean, where he spent the rest of his days. Like in Barbados, many Quakers in Jamaica were slave owners. George urged them to treat their slaves as indentured servants. He advised including them in worship, educating them, and preparing them to earn a living when they were set free. When George and friends sailed away from Jamaica toward America, wouldn't you know it, the ship with the cheaper rates sprang a leak. Fortunately, it was fixed fairly soon by the ship's carpenter. The man would jump overboard and work underwater until he had the hole plugged up. Now, here are a few interesting events that happened in the American colonies. I'll briefly comment on each one. To do with Florida, Between the coast of Florida and the Bahamas, George's ship hit extremely rough weather. Ships in these waters were always afraid of falling into the hands of certain Florida Indians who were thought to be cannibals. Even Christopher Columbus had encountered this pervasive myth. When George wrote of seeing the Florida coast, he described it as a place where man-eaters live. He may have meant alligators or other dangerous creatures, but I think it's likely he had those mythical cannibals in mind. The worst thing that happened near Florida was a storm. It blew off the ship's jib sail, the long pole stretching out on the bow of the ship like the one you see in the picture. Fortunately, the jib sail was recovered and reattached. After arriving on American shores, George began visiting Quaker meetings. He helped them incorporate the organizational structure followed by Quakers in England. And in particular, he led them to have separate meetings for business for women and men. This system gave women the benefit of having a voice in the full meeting's decisions, and this was in addition to their established roles of caring for the poor and preparing couples for marriage. As George ministered in the colonies, it was not unusual for him to encounter backsliders and ranters. Backsliders, of course, were Quakers who had drifted away from the faith. Ranters were radical mavericks who disputed all sorts of religious authority. George was able to convince many of both of these to reform. One day when George was traveling with a group, a rider was thrown from his horse. His neck seemed broken and he wasn't breathing, so his friends decided he must be dead. But George attended the man, manipulated his neck, and the man began to breathe again. In fact, the man felt well enough the next day to resume riding, and because of that, many felt that George had performed a miracle. George cared very much for the American Indians. Some colonists felt that Indians had no souls, but George believed there was that of God in them as in everyone, so he included them in his ministry. Some Indians he met with could actually speak English. Others required an interpreter. In New England, he spoke with a distraught Indian who explained that Quakers were his favorite of all the religious groups he had met. But he didn't dare to become one, because where he lived, Quakers were being severely persecuted. George encountered some Quakers who followed a man named John Parrott. John Parrott was an English Quaker extremist. He once went to Rome hoping to convert the Pope. Now, the followers of Parrott rejected a number of traditional Quaker practices. The one they were most famous for was being against men removing their hats during public prayer, like most Quakers did. Roger Williams, the leader of the Puritans in Rhode Island, had a low opinion of Quaker beliefs. When he heard that George Fox was going to be in nearby Newport, Rhode Island, Roger Williams decided he wanted to go there to confront George. Roger was quite an old man, but he wanted to debate George so badly that he rowed a boat all night to get to Newport. He arrived too late, though. George had already left the city. Williams went on to publish a scathing book attacking George's teachings. From the title of Roger Williams' book, George Fox Digged Out of His Burrows, It's pretty obvious that he was out to expose what he considered to be George's false doctrines. But George later retaliated with a written response to Williams entitled "A New England Firebrand Quenched," that poured cold water on Roger Williams' claims. After a year or so in America, George felt ready to sail home back to England, and he must have been very thankful that his ship took a nice direct route across the Atlantic. This ship was called the Society of Bristol, and it brought George to the port city of Bristol after 5.5 weeks at sea. At the top of this slide is part of George's message to his wife, telling Margaret that he has returned safely to England. "Dear heart, we came into Bristol near night from the sea. Glory to the Lord forever, who hath carried us through many perils." Now that expression, "many perils," became the theme of a long litany George later wrote in his journal about all the difficult things he had faced during his visit in America. God's power carried us through many dangers and perils by sea and land. Wolves, bears, tigers, lions, rattlesnakes, and other venomous creatures, through great swamps, bogs, and wilderness where no way was, over great bays, creeks, and rivers in open small boats and canoes, through great storms and ocean tempests beyond words to utter, through Indian countries or wildernesses where man-eaters lay in wait for us, through cold, rain, frosts, and snow, until some of us had hands and fingers benumbed. I was an eyewitness to some who had noses, fingers, and toes frozen off. And through perils of robbers by land and pirates by sea, with which the sea abounds. I'll close now with an experience of George's that I found kind of amusing. This happened when he was enduring harsh winter weather on the Virginia coast. He was traveling with a group of men in a small open sailboat. Each night they'd be shivering and soaking wet from the ocean spray, and they would go ashore to get warm and dry. The nights there were so cold that their drinking water froze solid as it sat right next to their campfire. One of these dreadful nights they stopped to camp in a place called Point Comfort, and George seems to have found some irony in the name. We were glad to get to shore at Point Comfort, Virginia, where yet we found but small comfort. I looked up Point Comfort. It's a place that still exists, but I haven't found any acknowledgement by the town that George Fox once visited their historic little seaside community. I think they should proudly recognize it with a sign displayed along the highway. Well, George's hazardous trip to America gives me a fresh perspective and a deep appreciation for the man. What a spirit. What remarkable faith and courage he had. He did a lot to strengthen American Quakers and to improve ties between them and the Quakers in Britain. We all owe him so much for his ministry in our country. Thank you very much for watching.